Welcome back to 4 for 4's the most accurate podcast. As always, I'm your host, John Daigle, and it's a very special episode here at 4 for 4 because we are joined today by none other than our own TJ Hernandez. TJ, how is everything going, buddy?
What's up, dude? I'm doing great. Kind of finally getting in the flow of redraft. I've been working on some other things this offseason that aren't directly related to redraft or season long. So getting my beak wet here with Best Ball Mania launching and whatnot.
I was updating content schedule, and it hit me that really we have only a month of the quote-unquote off-season left.
Yeah.
And that's like if we consider this next month an off-season, since something happens every single day. So yeah, we are gearing up. I'm very excited, as I'll talk about the end of the show as well. I might as well move it to the front here because John Paulsen's putting out his projections Friday, I believe, is what he was targeting, which means then next week, especially, we come out with my best ball tiers. You're wrapping up your best ball strategy article, and then also putting out videos and articles on exploiting default ATB across sites for best ball and redraft. We really are getting going here. And so it is a fun time. And because of that, you are here because you have already nearly wrapped up your series, the Best Ball Mania Bible, describing the best strategies for the Underdog Best Ball Mania 3 tournament. And I actually just want to get right in here because everyone is curious about tell us a little bit about the series before I start picking apart your brain with questions.
Yeah, so for those that are new to Underdog or new to Best Ball, Underdog has been doing this is 3 years running now. They've been doing their Best Ball Mania tournament. They have some other tournaments too, but just in general, Best Ball tournaments are relatively new to the industry, rather than your typical season-long league where you're only playing against 11 other people, or even just your typical Best Ball league where it's the same. You're just competing against 11 other entries. It's been thousands. Now it's up to hundreds of thousands of other entries. A 4-round tournament. This year, first place is $2 million. So you could go at Underdog and look at the exact structure details for that. But basically, what this has been is going through the data of those first 2 years and really just trying to tease out winning strategies that we can use for this tournament. A lot of people that are familiar with Best Ball might look at that and say, well, we have tons of data on these types of things. We kind of know what works in Best Ball. Like I said, we've never really had these size of tournaments before, this breadth of tournament. So looking for things that are unique to the tournaments. And again, one thing we saw a lot last year was so many people looked at that first Best Ball Mania and said, oh, this is what you need to do. This is the gospel. Now we have 2 years of data. What lined up with what we saw the first year, what didn't line up, just trying to figure these things out because tournament is a very different beast. Like you might know from DFS. I mean, when you're trying to beat hundreds of thousands of people instead of 11, it's really different. And a lot of Best Ball formats have been either full PPR, tight end premium. Underdog's unique in that it is half PPR, no defense, no kicker. So again, a lot of the old Best Ball things that we might think we know maybe don't work in this format where it is half PPR.
And when Paulsen puts out those projections, we will have articles on how to fine-tune them for FFPC Underdog tournaments. But for Underdog and specifically, you and I have talked about this behind the scenes. This one is so unique in that having 415,000 entries over a 17-week contest, you literally have to be perfect every single week. Like, not only do you have to get the structure right, and that's the most important part, you then have to get into the player analysis and get the players right too. And that's much more difficult since it entails like to have a little bit of hubris and luck all at the same time. And that's why I'm excited to talk about it with you. And I want to start with the actual infrastructure of winning lineups and potential similarities and trends among those that advance. So in your research, what was the most important criteria you discovered among those lineups that played into the final rounds?
Yeah, so you mentioned the final round, and I think it's really important to make that distinction when we're talking about any of the strategies we're going to talk about in this podcast, right? Because two things that we really look at are first round advance rates, which just give us a really big sample. Every team over the last 2 years that has got out of their initial 12-team league, and that's important, right? Because the more you do that, the more chances you're going to give yourself to advance in the tournament. You obviously have to get out of there, but also building in upside to our team, things that might differ from getting out of that first round to making it to the final round, actually having a chance to win $2 million. So just always keeping that in mind when we talk about those things. But to that point, I'll just go over some of the things that I have found that work both in getting out of that first round and that also we found similar in that final round teams. And one thing that has just really stood out over the past couple of years has just been the domination of teams that have used 2 quarterbacks as opposed to 3. And we'll talk about this when we get into some of the drill down into some of the positional draft strategies and when to be taking these players. But very overwhelming out of all the other positions when we just talk about how many players to take at each position. The 2 versus 3 quarterback has been the one that's really stood out. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it. We only have 18 roster spots. It's not a position that you can use to fill your flex position, where even with tight end, if you draft 2 instead of 3, sometimes that third tight end might fill your flex position for you. And you want to be a lot of what we're doing is going to be like concentrating on offenses that we're targeting, not necessarily players. So if we have a lineup where we're just kind of trying to concentrate on a couple offenses or a couple quarterbacks, it's going to be easier to do that than with 3 quarterbacks. Now, with all that said, the 2020 champion did use a 3 quarterback build, so we shouldn't completely discount that. But that's one thing that's really stood out just in terms of how many players, the very basis, the very skeleton of best ball. That's the one strategy that's really stood out, whether it's getting out of the first round or making it to the final round.
So even though we are trying to be pragmatic, right, in the first round and allow the board to come to us, is there a strategy? You mentioned 2 QB builds, but is there an overarching strategy we should be looking at, whether we're in the first or the back, making our first pick?
Yeah. Again, going back to what I looked at initially with the first round playoff advance rates, and this is kind of prevalent whether you're playing in a best ball tournament on Underdog or just a regular 12-team league on Underdog. We'll call it like the safe strategy versus the upside strategy, the safe being getting out of that first round, or aka winning your league. What we've really found, as you said, kind of starting with that early round strategy, that some form of hero running back, or what I've called superhero running back this year. That means taking 1 or 2 running backs in the first 2. You call it first 3 rounds, but I like to call it the first 2 rounds. Not taking another running back till later in the draft, kind of avoiding that running back dead zone. So again, 1 to 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds, and then not taking another running back till round 7, 8, sometimes even like round 10, and then getting 2 quarterbacks in the mid rounds. Not reaching for a high-end quarterback, but trying to lock in 2 top, we'll call it top 12-ish quarterbacks in terms of ADP without getting like the first or second quarterback off the board. Combining those 2 things together has just shown advance rates, whether it be advancing to the playoffs or advancing to the final round. Some form of those 2 things has just really been dominant roster strategy.
I asked you 2 questions and you've already come back with 2 strong answers that now I have to untangle this web, and I knew this was going to happen. Yeah. And so let's get back to superhero RB then, because everyone's aware of zero RB. Everyone's aware of anchor, where you take 1 early and then leave it alone. With superhero RB, you said 2 in the first 3 rounds, ideally the first 2 rounds, and then wait till later. What exactly do you mean by later? Like, is there a specific round people should be targeting their third running back, and how many? Is there a specific number we're looking to have?
Yeah, I've kind of gone through as many iterations of this as I can, and we'll stick with the superhero RB. Let's just say, for conversation's sake, your first 2 picks are running backs. And again, this is half PPR, so I mean, I think that probably has a little bit to do with it. We haven't seen this work as strongly in PPR best ball leagues. I think you probably don't want to take another running back until kind of the cutoff for where we've seen these advance rates really start to spike is after round 6. Again, that's kind of been what we've called the running back dead zone. So rounds 3 through 5, 3 through 6, just loading up on whatever other positions, wide receiver, one dominant tight end, maybe get one other quarterback in that mix. But where we really have seen it take off the advance rates is when people really commit to the strategy, not taking their third running back till round 9 or 10, because then it allows you to not only bulk up your other positions, because there's so much value at quarterback, tight end, and then there's just a gang of wide receivers you could load up on in those rounds, but it really leans into the strength of your team. Like if you're spending that much draft capital on a position early, and this goes for any position really, that much draft capital early in the draft, if they don't hit, your team's probably going to have a really rough time anyway, right? So the idea of taking 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds and then say, oh, this guy's a great value in round 5, I'm going to take him. How often is that guy cracking your roster? Or how weak are you making your wide receivers or your top tight end by taking that guy that often isn't going to crack your top 2 when you've already taken those 2 dominant guys? So really waiting as long as you can if you're going to commit to this type of superhero build. And then to the same point, if you're spending that much draft capital on that kind of position, you don't need to go overboard on the running back build. So usually like 5 running backs is going to be more than enough. If you take 2 in the first 2 rounds, you're going to have a little bit of weakness at the other position. Like that's probably going to be like a 9 wide receiver type build. So I would say third running back somewhere in rounds 7 through 10. Later the better, I think. And I'm usually probably only ending up with 5 running backs in that build.
If you take 4 because you're so confident in your superhero build, is there a specific position like wide receiver or tight end that we should be looking to allocate that last spot to, with like 10 wide receivers or 3 or 4 tight ends? Or does it really depend on your build? It's roster dependent.
Yeah, I think it's almost always going to be allocated to my wide receiver. You're going to be building floor and upside through your quantity of wide receivers and a third tight end. But on a week to week level, even the best wide receivers in the league, right? They're going to have weeks where they only get 7 or 8 targets, 7 or 8 catches. Even to Devontae Adams last year, there's going to be weeks where he gets you 7 for 70 and no touchdown. That's just not a fantastic fantasy week. But with an extra wide receiver, whether it's the wide receiver 1 on a team or wide receiver 4 on a team, you're gonna have more opportunities for them to quote unquote hit in a given week. So even if I do take say 4 running backs, which has worked, I don't think I'm just like blindly allocating that. Most of the time it's probably going to be to another receiver.
You also mentioned 2 quarterback builds in between the superhero RB builds. And so is there a precise round we are trying to draft our QB 1 and 2?
Yeah, where again, kind of going through all of the iterations, one thing that has really stood out, again, this is just a 2-year sample, but what we've seen these last 2 years that kind of ties into what we've seen just with the quarterback trend in general, is that reaching for your quarterback, for your first quarterback, hasn't been overly profitable. There is some upside in having, last year a lot of Josh Allen teams made it. He was the first or second quarterback taken off the board, depending on your league. But in general, kind of nabbing your quarterback in round 6 through 11 has really shown extreme returns, at least in the first round advance rate, and even bigger in round 6 through 9. And I think the round 6 through 9 for a couple reasons compared to round 6 through 11. 6 through 11, you're kind of getting in that like QB4 to fringe top 12 QB range. You might get some QB 13, QB 14. Round 6 through 9, you're almost always getting like a QB 5 or 6 with like a QB 9 or 10. And the reason that's worked is for a couple reasons. One, we've just had the mobile but also efficient quarterback really show up in these top quarterbacks in fantasy over the last couple of years, which has made it very easy to predict. We've become phenomenal over the past couple of years at predicting top 12 quarterbacks. Over the past 3 years, only 2 to 3 quarterbacks drafted outside the top 12 has finished as such. And years before, it's kind of been like you can there's 5 or 6 late round quarterbacks that could crack the top 12. That just hasn't been the case. So we want to lock those guys in, not just because they're predictable, but also because the combo of the mobile and efficient quarterback, they just are scoring so many more points than the other fantasy quarterbacks. And we see the Kirk Cousins throwing 37, 38 touchdowns and still can't hold a candle to guys like Jalen Hurts, who might be scoring less touchdowns through the air, but just doing so much on the ground. So the quarterback scoring has become way less linear over the past couple of years. In the past, it's just been the drop off from quarterback 10 to quarterback 19 hasn't been that extreme. Now it's really extreme. So getting a couple guys in that 6 to 10 range has been really important.
You mentioned grabbing the QB2 by 9, and usually with all these strategies in my head while drafting, it has to become muscle memory very quickly, especially when you do only slow drafts like me. I just find it easier to look at 20 notifications at once and then rattle it all off, knowing what's going on. By like June, I think last year I had week 17 games memorized, and it's like I know what I'm doing.
I'm trying to have that memorized by tomorrow. Schedule's dropped tonight.
But no, so with 6-9 though, it's a very nice strategy to remember. It's no big deal. Nice. Having said that though, is there a diminishing return point where someone should scrap this idea and maybe pivot to 3 quarterbacks? Like, at what point should we ensure we hit the panic button and say, I need QB2 because we're after round 9 right now. We're in X round, and I need to make sure this happens no matter what the quality of the player is around him on the board left.
Yeah, this goes for any, whether we're talking about the quarterback strategy or whether we're talking about the overall roster construction. I mean, anytime you get into a situation where you're forcing a build or you're locked into a build, whether it be in the round you're in or just even going into the draft, I think you're kind of already behind. For the vast majority of the things we're going to talk about here, it's going to fall into the kind of this category of letting the draft come to you. You talked about the early round, just kind of getting your natural exposure to guys, just how the draft falls. And a lot of these things are just going to be determined on how your draft is going, where you're positioned in the draft, right? Because if you're drafting number 1, it's going to be way easier to have a hero RB than it is if you're drafting 12, right? Especially if the first 8 picks off the board are running back. That goes the same for quarterback. If you're in a draft where quarterbacks are flying off the board, going a round earlier than usual, don't force it. Don't take your second quarterback in the 7th round because you took Josh Allen the 4th, like, I need 2 top 12 quarterbacks, and they're going on. Now you spend a two picks in the top 6 rounds on quarterback. Like, don't do that. Let this draft come to you. A lot of being successful in these drafts still comes down to exploiting ADP, as you talked about, getting extreme value on these players, not just players that are going to beat their ADP by a round, but players that are going to being drafted as wide receiver 4s, they're going to finish the wide receiver 1s. If those players are available and your draft dictates that, it doesn't make sense to take an early quarterback, by all means do that. We've seen in the final rounds, there were quite a few teams that only ended up with 1 of these mid-round quarterbacks and then decided to take 2 late QBs. Going back to that 2020 championship team, I believe it was a Matt Ryan team that actually ended up winning the championship. If I remember back then, the week 16 team, it was when it was still a 17-week season. I believe it was the Matt Ryan stack that did very well. So we still want to, in poker terms, give ourselves outs, right? We don't want to be very strict in these rules. We want to be very fluid in these drafts.
Let's dive into wide receiver a bit because I think everyone enters drafts and just thinks they want to come away with 9 to 11. Sure. Let's say 8 to 11, but there has to be clearly more to it than just a number. So really, when are we ideally looking to take wide receivers, and are there kinds of wide receivers that we're trying to take? Not like target hogs, right? That goes without saying. But are we looking to, and this goes into probably even a bigger question and a bigger answer, but are we making sure we correlate wide receivers with a certain position on our roster?
Your first question, when are we trying to take quarterbacks?
Yeah, let's back up and do the first one, because I think
they're
that
two
last
really
part,
big questions.
Yeah.
I kind of look at wide receiver and running back strategy kind of is one and the same. They're always going to be the inverse of each other, right? If we're getting our wide receivers early in the draft, then we're going to end up with less of them. If we're getting our running backs early in the draft, we're going to end up with more wide receivers. So it's really they're really a function of one another. So like I talked about with my superhero running back builds, how many wide receivers I'm taking is really going to be dependent on, 1, my early round capital, and 2, how well they fit into my roster. If I end up with 2 or three like target hogs, if I somehow end up with I don't know, a Cup Devontae Michael Pittman build, I'm going to be a lot more comfortable coming out of that draft with 7 wide receivers than if I don't get my first wide receiver until, even wait until the second round, and maybe only coming out of the first 4 rounds with 2 wide receivers. So it's going to really just go back to that initial early round draft equity is how I'm going to kind of think about how I'm drafting each position. And as you said, a lot of this is muscle memory. If you do tens or even hundreds of these drafts, especially over the last couple of years, you kind of really fall into this pattern. I don't want to say fall into this pattern, but get this muscle memory of understanding the top end of my roster is kind of weak based on how I started. So I might pass up on what I think is a quote unquote good running back value in these middle rounds because I realize I really need to beef up my roster construction at wide receivers. So I think a lot of it just goes back to that early round equity and how you are allocating number of players at each position.
Everyone, of course, likes making sure with the wide receiver position they stack with their quarterback.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts? Have you done any research into perhaps, let's say, one, like the wide receiver 1 on a team, drafting with your quarterback, maybe the wide receiver 3 or 4, like an ancillary option, maybe 2 wide receivers, double stacking the bottom tier on that offense? Like, what are your thoughts on how to stack, in particular, the wide receiver position with your quarterback?
I've kind of just started digging into the stacking data. Sam Hoppin at 4for4 is actually working on a stacking tool that we're going to be releasing to the public here for Underdog specific leagues in the next couple of weeks. What is crazy, and this goes to whether it's these final round rosters we've talked about or just general advance rates, the wide receiver stack that has really stood out above all has been teams that have used a wide receiver 4 on their roster. And when I say wide receiver 4, we're talking about in terms of ADP relative to their teammates. So wide receiver 4 is the 4th teammate drafted from his own team. And we have actually seen wide receiver 1 stacks do pretty poorly compared to a bunch of other stack combos. I think that is just a function. It's still one of the highest used stacks and one of the most represented stacks in the finals. But again, I think that's just because it's so popular. I think that's a function of teams or fantasy managers are really reaching to complete these quarterback wide receiver stacks, forcing these wide receiver 1 stacks with their quarterbacks, where with these wide receiver 4s, or we could just talk about ancillary players in general, when we get deeper on the depth chart, especially a position like wide receiver where a lot of players are going to be involved throughout a season, there's a couple things that are going to happen. One, I think we're just generally pretty bad at projecting how that plays out over the course of the season. I think we're really good at knowing who's going to be the wide receiver 3 in week 1. Pretty good at figuring that out. Who's going to be the wide receiver 3 or even wide receiver 2 come week 17 after injuries. After players play bad, after trades, after cuts, we're pretty bad at projecting that because it's hard to project 18 weeks out. We can't predict injuries for the most part. So I think there's just a lot of value in, 1, not reaching to complete a stack, and 2, kind of leaning into the unknown with whether it's a RB2 or a wide receiver 4, how that position battle is going to play out, how these players are going to get opportunities later in the year. Some of those ADP values, as we discussed, that's where some of the best come from. Late round wide receivers have some of the highest hit rates in terms of advance rate over expectation of any position.
You may have not reached this point yet, but any personal thoughts on what we should consider as reaching? Because this is something I always go back to over and over again, like 4 or 5 spots. I do it, and I can't even tell you with certainty that it's not egregious, right? Like maybe it is egregious. I really don't know. And so what are your thoughts on that?
I haven't quantified what would constitute a reach. I have done some quick and dirty research that has shown that teams that have advanced, whether it be past the first round or again to the final round, have been teams with some of the biggest, let's call it draft equity in terms of ADP, players overperforming their ADP. Now, of course, a lot of that is just going to have to do with, like, if you hit on a Cooper Kupp or something like that, like that's just going to skyrocket those numbers, right? So that those numbers are kind of skewed by those types of players. I would say if you're drafting within the, and this is anecdotal, I would say if you're drafting within the player's ADP round, so if he's going at 6.5 overall and you take him at 6.3 to complete a stack, that's probably not very egregious, right? That player's there. We're playing for upside. You want that. You want to complete those stacks, especially schedule's coming out tonight. We're getting week 17 games. Week 17 is when you can win $2 million. I'm going to have more weight on figuring out what players I want from the game. I think we got a leak that there's going to be a Bills Bengals Monday night game week 17. Like, I'm gonna have a lot of Bills and Bengals on my team because that's most likely to be a high scoring game. I want that to hit. But when you talk about reaching to complete those stacks, let's just think about how your players are going to score points. Let's use that as an example. If I want a Stephon Diggs, Josh Allen stack for that week 17 game, and let's say I get Diggs and whatever his ADP is the second round, and I reach for Josh Allen 5 picks before, what am I really accomplishing with that stack? These guys are studs. They're at the top of their positional rankings. Their projections to be as high. Those guys are going to score kind of regardless of if their teammate goes off, right? Like Josh Allen can go off without Stephon Diggs going off. Stephon Diggs can have a big game and kind of just suck up all of the targets in the game. And it wouldn't be surprising if we get down to like an Isaiah McKenzie and pair him with a Josh Allen. I take Isaiah McKenzie a round ahead of his 15th round ADP. That might be more valuable than taking Josh Allen or Stephon Diggs a couple picks early, because it's going to be more likely that if my Isaiah McKenzie is brought along in a stack, it's because the team is going off. Does that make sense? Like Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs could kind of go off independent of a big game from their team, where these ancillary players, most likely they're going to go off because their team is just having an insane game. Gabriel Davis AFC Championship game.
Yeah, I think it absolutely makes sense. And it actually feeds into the next question I want to ask you, and that is, in round 17 or 18, we all have reached that spot where it is a seemingly good player. At least we perceive so personally, and we want to grab them. But also there's an individual there that fits within our stacks. Do you think it's better plus EV to go ahead and get that player that fits in your stack? Or are we really just looking to complete the overall build? Like, is it better to be plus EV with your stacks basically, or do you think the build should come first?
If we're talking about specifically the last 2 rounds, and the 2 things I'm going to look to do is complete cheap stacks, target offenses that I love just in general. Again, I'll just keep using the Bills as an example. Even if I don't have any Bills and I just have a bunch of players or whatever I kind of like, I'm going to take an Isaiah McKenzie every single time over a Bears wide receiver 3 that I know is going to play 80% of snaps. I don't care. I'd rather have the player on the good offense, or trying to get really unique, looking for players that are really down on the depth chart, rookies that aren't projecting for a ton of playing time but can have breakout years. So to answer your question, like I'm probably going to lean more towards completing stacks, targeting offenses, looking for players that aren't going to be on a lot of rosters late in the rounds than just completing a roster build. Because here's what people get wrong a lot. You just said we have a quote-unquote good player, a player we like in round 17 or 18. For the most part, and I'm not saying this is you, but the average drafter, if they have a good play in week 17 or 18, unless that's like a rookie you think could break out late in the season, most people are thinking, oh, this is a guy that can play 75% of the snaps and, get 15 to 16% of their team's targets. If that guy's getting you 3 to 5 fantasy points a week, that might as well be 0, right? Those points are almost never going to be usable. So the quote unquote good plays in those late rounds are plays that are probably never going to win you tournaments, beating 400,000 people. So that's just a long way of saying I'd rather complete stack. I'd rather target really good offenses, even if it's a wide receiver 5 or a tight end 3 or something like that.
And I want to stress this year in particular, since not only does the winner get $2 million.
Yeah.
So everyone, of course, look at week 17 games, the best matchups, and stack accordingly.
Yep.
Since the highest scoring regular season team gets $1 million to him or herself. I do think it's important that once we get the schedule release, to use your tools in particular, especially when we do adjusted strength of schedule at 4for4.com. I am going to break down like weeks 10 through 14. Like I do want to make sure I segment the easiest schedule, the easiest offenses in the last month of the season, and then stack accordingly with that offense. Trying to set myself up a la Sam Darnold's like easiest schedule for quarterbacks in the first 6 weeks last year. Like his plummet, I guess, should have been more predictable, but like his breakout, not the rushing yards so much, but like the easy matchups. There's a reason why we were drafting Sam Darnold through week 6. And it's because even in redraft leagues, we knew about his schedule. And I want to do the same thing at the back end of the schedule as well.
And are you saying like in terms of targeting that regular season points? Is that what you're talking about? The
last month. So basically weeks 11 through 14, 11, 12, 11 through 14. I do want to segment that and try to stack players within that range as well, just in case, like in that last month, I'm in a position maybe not to make the playoffs, but I can be like the highest scoring team. I guess if you're the highest scoring team, though, you would be also.
Yeah, I think I've kind of thought about this a little bit. I've only done one BBM draft, so I'm not sure how I'm going to adjust. I think the only thing that I would say about that is to win the highest scoring team, you're gonna have to run pure no matter what to win, right? But you're gonna have to run pure for when did playoffs start? Week 14. You're gonna have to run pure for 13 straight weeks to win that, right? You're basically you're gonna have to beat out all 400 whatever plus 1,000 players. So I think probably maximizing these things like our first round advance rate, and as we get into like deeper player analysis and how to hit on these players, maximize your chances for that. It might kind of like take care of itself. Whereas something like if we're going to like really narrow in on a schedule time, it makes sense to be week 17, because if we do all the things that are right enough and we're lucky enough to get there, again, only 460 teams I think are making it. So what's that? 0.001% of the field is even making it to the final round. At the very least, we know like how to build to run pure. Like, right, if we make it there, we need to run perfect in week 17. We could kind of do things to maximize that idea. I don't. I have to think about it a lot more. I don't know if like prioritizing that is going to be something that will like push my builds per se.
That makes sense. It's something I've just been thinking on since they pretty much changed the rules. And even mid-drafts, I've done less than 10, but also it's something I go back to and thinking, okay, we don't know the schedule just yet, but maybe if these builds aren't coming together, I then start stacking to just try to form the highest scoring team as opposed to the team that's with the highest advance rate. That's
fair. Or if you have I think if you really understand all of our these concepts we're talking about, and you do digging through the best ball Bible, digging on your own, and for whatever reason, like your team, and this is going to happen if you do upwards of 100 drafts, there's just going to be teams where you're like, I tried to build this upside, I got sniped, I just didn't do what I thought I was going to do. I think then, like what you're saying, like, you know what, let me just build this as a regular season team. I think that can make sense. And how sick is it going to be when whoever wins just doubles down? The regular season winner just gets the 2 million and the 1 million.
Insane. Absolutely insane. We've talked about 2 quarterbacks, the round 6 through 9.
Yeah.
Very nice strategy. We also discussed waiting for or your third running back and thus starting your draft in the first 2, ideally 2 rounds, first 3 rounds, 2 running back for superhero RB. These are the ideal strategies. We have not talked about tight ends yet though. And so where does tight end fall in all of this as we're trying to secure the mid-round QB and early RBs?
Tight end has been all over the place. And again, this is just looking at 2 years of Underdog data. If we look at a wide data set going back to like as long as best ball's been popular, we have seen elite tight end be a very good strategy, taking one of the top 3 tight ends in the first 3 rounds. In general, that has worked very well. But again, that's been a lot of PPR data. That's been a lot of leagues where it's tight end premium, a lot of that data. We really only have 2 years of this big field, half PPR data. I still think that I want a fair amount of my exposure to the elite tight ends because it's going to be the biggest advantage gap. Even this year, like I don't think much has changed in terms of the scope of tight ends. I don't think we're going to have a year where the gap isn't huge between the top few guys. But at the same time, those options are very limited, right? Even if you want to take elite tight ends, there's only so many of them. And depending on where you're at in your draft, you just might not be able to draft definitely a Travis Kelce, maybe even a Mark Andrews. And then you're still going to kind of be at the mercy of the draft for a Kyle Pitts, Darren Waller type. So we've seen strategies kind of scattered all over the place. It's been very clear that, taking more than 3, you're just kind of wasting draft capital because we want to be loading up on those running backs, wide receivers. There hasn't been, the only strategy that has been grossly unsuccessful has been a pure late round tight end strategy, and that is because most people have been, it's just, if you're late round tight end, not taking your first tight end until after, let's say, around 12, most people are just using 3. If one of them don't get hit, you're kind of screwed. So whether it's the couple things I would really point out, if you take a very early tight end, you're sticking with 3, you're probably not taking your tight end 2 till that round 12 to 14 range. If you're not doing that, something that has really stood out for the final round teams, not in playoff advance rate, final round teams, we saw a lot of final round teams the last couple of years draft 2 tight ends in the middle rounds, like in rounds 5 through, say, 11. And that runs very contrary to what we have seen in playoff league win rates or playoff advance rates. And I think that has to do with upside over safety. We've seen quite a few players over the past 2 years come out of the middle rounds as tight ends that have been dominant in terms of win rate. A couple of those players, Mark Andrews was the obvious one last year, and then Darren Waller and Gronk 2 years ago. So I think there's something to be said, if you're talking about pure upside, to targeting 2 tight ends in the middle rounds, because that's where you can kind of maximize your opportunity to get these actual league winners at tight ends. Assume if Travis Kelce doesn't have a career year like he did 2 years ago, I think you're maximizing upside there, because we just haven't seen tight ends from the late round blow away the field.
That's what I was talking. I was talking with you on Mark Andrews and Slack, and I did come into the season knowing I wanted to be behind consensus, below consensus on Andrews, given most likely regression, since if you look at the splits between Lamar Jackson and Huntley, very clearly like Andrews thrived with Huntley because he was more accurate 10 plus yards downfield. Having said that, to your point, I then backtracked a little bit because the mid-range is still, and not like mid-range and drafting tight ends middle rounds, the mid-range of the quality of players I still think drops off significantly because it is the most volatile position. And so I got back on the Mark Andrews train.
Well, and when we had that talk, Marquise Brown was still on the team. So that's a big difference.
True too.
That's a really big
Turns out it helped
too.
out a lot when the leader in air yards suddenly gets chipped off out of nowhere.
Yeah. One other note on tight ends. One thing that, again, this is only a 1 year sample. It worked out last year because a couple late round tight ends went off. But if we're talking about upside, if we're talking about being unique, last year a lot of 4 tight end builds had very successful advance rates. That was a late round 4 tight end build. I think there's something to be said for that, kind of similar to the targeting a wide receiver 4, because we're really bad at projecting that back end of a position. We saw, I think Dawson Knox was the best example last year going off. So if you're going to get stuck in a late round tight end strategy, there might be something to be said for having 4 tight ends to maximize your upside at that position. Now, you're still using almost 25% of your draft picks on a onesie position with that. So I think it's a very unique situation. I think it's something that I don't find myself getting stuck in a late round tight end strategy very often. I think it would be something where I need to have an extremely strong and balanced build at all 3 other positions. But it is worth noting that 4 tight end builds did kind of pop last year in terms of that late round strategy. So Probably not something you should do a lot, but if you're thinking about ways to build a roster that other people aren't going to use, that's something to keep in the back of your mind.
And I will tell you, of course, we're talking about Best Ball Mania, totally different here, but I've actually been behind the scenes hammering 6-team leagues because I think the superhero RB, since we only think there are 7 workhorses right now, like 7 Bell's cows, hammering superhero RB and then waiting and pile driving 4 tight ends the back. Like, I think that's been the absolute best strategy. And then, of course, mixing in the Konami code quarterbacks because Jalen Hurts is still going too far down the list. And you don't even have to take on the risk of Trey Lance in 6 teams, since you are playing a floor essentially. You can grab another one. But yeah, I think 4 tight ends are in those fields easier way to go, since I'm basically trying to make up all my BBM money entry fees on the ROI I get from the easier leagues, the softer leagues. So that's what
that's a good no. If you're playing all this talk, all this digital ink I'm putting on BBM, 99.9% of us are going to run negative EV on this tournament.
I'm going to have 150 bullets in there. It is what it is, man.
It's just the structure is brutal, but it's fun, and we've never seen this type of upside in a tournament. So yeah, I think that again that's a whole nother podcast. I think on allocating your money if you're thinking about it in terms of a bankroll strategy. What are you trying to get out of best ball? If you're trying to return a tidy 20% and have a couple extra shekels for your Christmas gifts, you might want to play some other games.
It's the same as DFS conversation. Yeah, it's really what are you trying to do? Because there is no right or wrong answer unless you're putting your mortgage on it every month or every week. But otherwise, yeah. I mean, just if you want to play a $3 tournament with 400K entries because it has a top heavy payout, go it. I don't care.
And
I mean, fun as long as you don't mind losing the $3. That's fun.
And I don't want to speak for Underdog, but if they follow suit, there's going to be more tournament options this year. There's going to be smaller buy-in tournaments. There's going to be larger buy-in tournaments with smaller fields. The structures might even be a little bit better. So all of these. All of the strategy will pertain to all of those tournaments that they end up launching. So keep that in mind too. You don't have to fire off whatever it is for $3,500 at your 150 entries if you're not comfortable with it.
For all these reasons in the last 5 minutes, that's why I'm dragging you back on in a couple of weeks. Also because stacking in itself is a entirely different episode.
Yep.
But to wrap this thing up before you get out of here, I do want to ask, given the data that we have from stacks in the final rounds of previous years, are there any general positional trends that we should take away?
Yeah, I mean, I could just kind of rattle off
we're in no rush. Yeah, let's hear it.
Yeah, if we look at the stacks with the highest playoff advance rate over the last 2 years, the top 5 has been a QB with their RB2 and wide receiver 4, an RB2 with their wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 4, an RB2 with the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 4, an RB3 with tight end 1 and wide receiver 1. So just looking at those playoff advance rates, 2 things stand out to me. One, it's been a lot of the ancillary players. We only have 1 stack in there with the wide receiver 1. The rest have been 2 stacks in there with the wide receiver 1. The rest have been wide receiver 2s, running back 2s, which is crazy, and wide receiver 4s. So that kind of goes back to the points that we talked about of getting value on those late round wide receivers, because that's where the highest late round hit rates have been and how bad we've been. And I don't even think this might not even be a function of being bad at projecting running back 1s and running back 2s, but maybe projecting running back 2s, running back 3s, these late round running backs where we're not sure who the value pick is. A lot of times these running back 2s have shown a lot of value. The standalone value of a second running back, not even necessarily in a timeshare, but just the opportunity to outperform their ADP by a big number shows up with these ancillary skill position players. So by targeting whether it's a offense that we know is going to be great or an offense that we have breakout potential, not spending a ton of capital on completing those stacks, but getting their ancillary players. And if we look at the finals advance rates compared to the playoff advance rates, all of those things I said kind of hold up.
It makes a lot of sense, actually, because something I've always argued against zero RB, and again, I'm pragmatic. I do everything. I do whatever the board lets me to come. It's like memorizing quotes from Anchorman or Wedding Crashers, whatever the hell your favorite comedy is in life. If you can remember those quotes, of course you can remember the 4 or 5 different strategies you have in a best ball draft. It's very simple. But the argument against zero RB is that RBs have higher ceilings, and I understand
Sure.
like they're more volatile, they have lower floors. That's how we just wait and try to pick off the backups, right? But at the same time, like they're the ones who win you tournaments if you get it right. It's just a matter of getting it right. But for a tournament with 415,000 entries, you got to be right anyway. So I don't mind wasting those bullets on, like you said, superhero running back in hopes of getting those higher ceilings correct.
Somehow we've went 45 minutes on a best ball podcast without actually talking about zero RB, which might be a record. I will say that a note that kind of encompasses everything we've talked about is that these extreme builds, they get the most ink because they're the most polarizing. And I think what people really misunderstand, screw how to execute zero running back. You know, or whatever the extreme strategy you're talking about is, people are going to talk about all that all off season. I think what goes overlooked is how little you need to implement these strategies for them to be effective. Last season, less than 5% of the field used zero RB. So it's not like it's this thing that's sweeping the nation everybody's using, but it was represented by 10% of the finals field. So even though less than 5% of the field used it, it showed up in 10% of the final round rosters. What that means is you don't need to go into this best ball season thinking zero RB is my strategy, I'm doing it all the time. If you're drafting 100 teams, you only need to do it in 6 or 7 drafts to be quote unquote overweight on what the field is doing, right? And that's kind of naturally going to come to us. If the draft falls that way, usually a zero RB flow is going to just naturally fall to you 6 or 7 times out of 100 drafts. So you don't even need to force the issue on these extreme builds, and you don't need to use them that often for them to be effective.
And I've seen a few people for the clicks throw out the 3 RB, 11 wide receiver builds. And again, they're showing you that on Twitter, thus it lives forever. But remember, that literally made up I think there was an actual number, like a 0.01% of last year's build. Like you don't need to go that extreme, as you mentioned. You can do it a couple times because you have 150 bullets or however many you know you're going to play. Yeah. You know your number better than me. And that's what you essentially wasted on. And then from there, follow the strategy and the core principles.
And I think that I think about my roster constructions. If you're doing this and you're playing 150 teams, I think it's very smart to have some kind of tracking method. At the end of every draft, I just put, what draft strategy I used and my positional allocation in each draft, just so I know. But I'm not going out of my way to force these things until I don't know, let's say 50 drafts in. That it's kind of like the player exposure thing, right? We're going to get natural exposure to the roster constructions or to players just through volume. And then when we get into the back half of the season, then we could start managing these things. We could look and say, man, through 50 drafts, I've only done 1 zero running back build. So now I'm actually surprised. Let me do a couple more than I would expect, or vice versa. Like, oh man, I've fallen into 7 zero running back builds through 50 drafts. Let me skip the next opportunity for what looks like a running back build, and kind of start managing those things. So whether we're planting our flags on a player or a type of build, I think for the first half of the season, you could kind of just let it come naturally. And then later in the year is when we could really start managing these exposures, whether it be to players or positional allocations.
And I'll remind everyone that since we live in the age of distraction, our attention span dwindles, and that trickles down to ADP. Remember last summer how literally a player would bump up 48 hours later or fall down? Jamar Chase is the most recent example, but certainly not the only one, for no good reason. Like, it's just, we get so distracted so easily. Remember, you're going to have your chance. If you might not be getting a player right now, like I'm not getting any Breece Hall right now, for example, but I also know I'm going to get Breece Hall eventually. I'm not reaching for him.
Exactly.
I'm absolutely letting the summer come to me. And I think that's what's so important to remember in the Best Ball Mania tournament.
Yeah, I mean, I think the again, going back to what we talked about earlier in the podcast, no matter how good we are at managing these strategies, these positional allocations, these positional roster trends, we're still going to need to hit on these players to do well. And I think a lot of times we see, I think that the casual will jump in our mentions and be like, well, did you have Cooper Kupp? Well, if you don't have him, you're not winning anyway. And that's a very short-sighted way to look at it. If you do things like understand when players at each position are most likely to hit within chunks of a draft. Running back, dead zone, understanding those type of things, understanding that wide receivers have the highest hit rates in the late rounds, you're going to maximize your potential to hit on those players, right? So it's to have a dismissive attitude and be like, well, if I don't get that guy, I'm screwed anyway. You're just kind of doing yourself a disservice.
Also, if we don't win because we don't have Cooper Kupp, we still get $1 million for second place. That's okay. I'm glad they take it. TJ, tell everyone where they can find what we've talked about throughout the show and what else you have coming out at the site.
All things myself and Best Ball are concentrated on 4for4.com. As you mentioned, the Best Ball Mania Bible, a 6-part series. 4 of those parts are already out on the website, so go over there. Everything that we've talked about so far here is written on digital ink on there. Still have a couple articles coming out. As we mentioned, we're going to really drill down into stacking in Best Ball Mania, and I'm going to write an article on how to build a unique Best Ball Mania team. Other than that, we're focusing on a ton of player level stuff at 4for4 right now, myself included. Really getting into these player profiles with John Paulsen's projections coming out this week or next week, and us being done with the draft, now having landing spots. We can really start looking at these ADPs and start planting our flags on players going beyond what we just talked about and figuring out who we're going to be targeting the most in these drafts. So just hang around 4for4, hang out my Twitter at TJ Hernandez, and you'll find all of that good stuff.
Lots of dynasty content and even redraft player profiles from Justin Edwards, Chris Allen, Jennifer Eakins, the rest of the team as well. So the next calendar week especially is very big. Be at 4for4.com. And always remember, it's a new era. We come back in the offseason consistently twice a week. So rate and review the podcast, please. It certainly helps us out. Until then, from TJ and I, thanks again. We'll see you next week.